Hello, welcome and welcome back. This is Cultures of the Crisis, the lecture series in which cultural scientists present their research on cultural and social effects of the COVID-19 crisis. My name is Lippert, and I am Associate Professor in the Chair Group European Culture and Literature at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, which proudly presents this series. Today's lecture is part of a section of our series that deals with COVID-19 in Latin American contexts, as those members of the audience who have joined us on a regular basis in the past weeks might already know or might remember. And those regulars will also already be familiar with today's speaker, my very dear colleague, Dr. Konstantin Mierau, who has kindly helped out with participation management in some of the previous lectures. Thanks again for that, dear Konstantin. And this job is done today by our great colleague, Dr. Vera Alexander. Thank you again, dear Vera. So, Konstantin Mierau is Senior Lecturer for European Culture and Literature at this chair group, and he's also the Program Director of the Graduate School for the Humanities and the Director of the Federation of Graduate Schools in the Social Sciences and the Humanities here at the University of Groningen. His research focuses on the relationship between marginal groups and literary representations. He recently published the monograph entitled Capturing the Pícaro in Words with Routledge, and is currently conducting a study on the social and cognitive effects of fiction and media in prison environments, a project which is entitled Empathy Behind Bars, and which is obviously very much connected to today's presentation. Konstantin is also a key contributor to the network project Converging Horizons, Production, Mediation, Reception and Effects of Cultural Representations of Marginality, which is funded by the Chilean Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation. Konstantin's lecture today is based on research he has conducted together with Gonzalo Albornoz Barra, who is also one of the key contributors to Converging Horizons. Gonzalo holds an MA in Applied Social Science from the Universidad de la Frontera de Temuco in Chile. He is currently working on a PhD thesis, which is entitled Fictional Representation of Law, Legality and Justice in Popular Mass Media and the Construction of Legal Knowledge by Key Communities in the Prison Environment, under the supervision of Professor Pablo Valdivia and Konstantin Mierau. One last practical remark about today's session. The presentation will be given in English, as always, but during the Q&A afterwards, questions can be asked in either English or Spanish. The latter will then be translated into English for the other members of the audience. Será posible hacer preguntas en español. But before that, let's first and foremost hear what Konstantin himself has to say. So, dear Konstantin, welcome once more, and the floor is yours.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Florian, for this more than kind introduction, and also for organizing and coordinating this lecture series, which is so timely and also so necessary. Let's see whether I can get my presentation started, and then we can get right into the thick of it. Yes. So with a little luck, you'll all be able to see the first slide, or the introductory slide, which basically presents the central problem of this presentation. So how do lockup, incarceration, and the lockdown coincide? I think in the sort of general discourse about this situation, a lot of people have compared lockdown to a form of imprisonment, but I think from what we gathered in the research for this presentation, I can assure you that incarceration is a lot worse, and the convergence of lockdown and incarceration really exacerbates an already problematic situation. Now, before I sort of continue the presentation, I would very much like to state that this is based on a research collaboration with Gonzalo Albornoz, whom Florian has already introduced. But that the presenting will is something that I will take care of today. Now, let's get into this, and how better than to start looking at some media press coverage of COVID-19 in Chilean prisons. So although this is part of a more general study that studies the representation of COVID-19 in Latin American prisons, our case study for today is really going to focus on Chile. Now, I'll take you briefly through some of these headlines. So we see the situation in Chilean prison being compared to a time bomb, an explosive cocktail here in the lower left corner. We see rising cases of deaths. We see rising cases of infection, both among inmates and among prison guards and the many social workers and people associated with the prison environment. Now, what I'd like to do today is approach this press coverage as a form of biopolitics in which the individual, the body of the inmate, is sort of abstracted towards an aggregate that is then used to develop policies on lockdown in the lockup situation, policies on restricting visits to prisoners, well, any type of policy that concerns the prison environment. So before I continue developing this idea, I'd like to start out with key statements, sort of two central ideas that I'd like to share with you throughout this presentation, this conversation. The first is that the press coverage on COVID-19 in Chilean prisons constitutes a performance of biopolitics in which the inmate is framed as a danger to biosecurity. And I'll explain these concepts a little further as we move along. As a potential agent of physical violence in need of restraint and control. This press coverage maximizes institutional measures and the need for control and dominance, and minimizes the agency of the inmates themselves. And our conclusions also tell us that this falls in line with the generalized commodification of the life of the inmate, whose key value lies in the marketable image of violence and danger, rather than an image that oppose these master narratives. However, and we have conducted a series of interviews with the social actors living in and with the prison. These agents' perspectives by social actors living in and with the prison system construct a different image, showing, among others, the inmate's capacity for self-care and organization, as well as a series of tactical countermeasures, both in information gathering by inmates and prison officials who are not satisfied with press coverage, and the organization of everyday life in the prison situation. Yeah. So these two statements, one is really about the dynamics of the press coverage, and the other is about the tactics of everyday life that social actors in the prison system sort of oppose to this press coverage, require us to talk a bit about the concept of biopolitics, biosecurity, and the associated idea of bioeconomics on the one hand, and then talk about these agent perspectives that we've gathered in order to sort of contrast the tendencies in the press coverage. So let's get right into biopolitics. And this is a concept that was very much made sort of visible by Michel Foucault, but more recently it is the work of Lemke that has really helped to further develop the notion, but also derive a sort of an analytics of biopolitics. Now, biopolitics first. The objects of biopolitics are not singular human beings, but their biological features measured and aggregated on the level of populations. Now, a simple fact would be statistics on infection. these procedures make it possible to define norms, establish standards, and determine average values. So that will be using a certain level of infection to determine when or when not to lock down. It's this aggregate is in fact a curve that we're trying to flatten with a very sort of simple central image. Now, as a result, life has become an independent, objective, and measurable factor, as well as a collective reality that can be epistemologically and practically separated from concrete living beings. So this is where, for this abstract notion of life that is constructed in biopolitics, the life of the individual and the experience of the individual become subservient to that abstract notion of life, and practically separated from concrete living beings and the singularity of the individual experience. And what we're looking at here is sort of how this collective reality is constructed in press coverage, and what we can gather from agent perspectives about this singularity of individual experience. Let's see. So, next slide. Now, Lemke, in his recent work on biopolitics, sort of presents an analytics of biopolitics, and much more than spending a lot of time on defining the notion of biopolitics, I'm always interested in what sort of research questions can be derived from these notions. So I would invite you to read with me on the analytics of biopolitics. This would have the purpose of comprehending the regime of truth and its selectivity that constitutes the background of biopolitical practices. Must ask what knowledge of the body and life processes is assumed to be socially relevant. Yeah, so, I mean, the quick question is, whose disease is of interest, of political interest? Yeah. And by contrast, what alternative interpretations are devalued or marginalized? Yeah? Whose disease, perhaps mental state, is not of interest, is secondary, has to wait. The prison, the refugee camp, the other minorities. What scientific experts and disciplines have legitimate authority to tell the truth about life, health, or a given population? And what proposals and definitions of problems and objectives regarding processes of life are given social friction? Now, and here, of course, we're very much focusing on press coverage, but these questions also apply to the academic community. And so who is prioritized on our research agenda? And this is really a point where I'd like to briefly give a shout out to our project Converging Horizons, which studies the generation, the circulation, the reception, and the effects of cultural representations of marginality, to precisely find out how certain frames of ethnic minorities, specific gender identities, but also the incarcerated population, are generated in mass media discourse. Now, let's move on to the press coverage that we've studied. So what we've done is made an inventory of press coverage of the situation in Chilean prisons over the last 2 months. And we basically looked at mass media news content of sort of the width of the political spectrum, and we looked basically at the collection of hegemonic press coverage of the situation in prisons, and we with the objective of identifying the tendencies therein as a performance of the biopolitical construction of the inmate subject. And for this purpose, we followed a three-pronged, or sort of applied a three-pronged approach, where first we would identify tendencies in these media representations that we collected. And this is, to a very large extent, the work of Gonzalo Albornoz. And then we conducted a series of interviews with officials and social workers working in the prison system, which we intend to expand with interviews also with inmates or family members of inmates, to then interpret these from the perspective of biopolitics and bioeconomics. Now, so much for our methodology. Let's get into tendencies here. Now, just to start out with a probably the most obvious bias here, and that is the gender bias. So out of all the press coverage on COVID in prisons in Chile in these last 2 months, we found one focusing on a women's prison, which in itself, of course, reflects a bias, because I think the total was about 170 statements that we found, whereas, of course, the percentage of women's prisons is much higher than that. But in the coverage too, there was, of course, a very different emphasis. So when the women's prison was covered, which moreover was covered by a university news outlet, this presentation very much focused on the caregiving role of the female inmates who were employed in mask making, and the coverage really highlighted their contribution to this situation. This is, of course, in stark contrast to the representation of male prisons, which tend to cover or focus on the potential for violence, the potential for infection, the need to dominate the potential for riots and react to cases of hostage taking. Now, I'm also looking very much forward to the lecture by Dr. Jurek, Dr. Antone, and Dr. Rob, who I think will focus precisely on how the agency of women and men is framed in the representation of this COVID-19 crisis. But also for the representation of the prisons, this is very much a factor. Now, another tendency is very much focusing the agency of the government and measures. So government agents visit prisons to see that measures are applied and security is maintained. And in this wonderful picture on your right, you see that everyone is, of course, maintaining the prescribed distance and wearing their masks. This is the lobby of the Temuco prison where we've done some field work. And of course, when looking at these measures and using those to measure success, then I mean the situation is fairly under control. You know, if your indicators for success are, of course, infection rates. But this emphasis on the government measures very much minimizes the also present positive agency of inmates, and also the fact that they're quite capable of taking on caretaker roles, and of course do so at times in absence even of the resources and care as provided by the institutions. So one of the prison officials commented on the fact that the prisoners started to help themselves among themselves, and that those that received government subsidies shared those with other inmates to be able to buy food or hygiene products, and thus avoid extra economic costs for their families outside, and avoid that these families would have to come over and bring food, and thus run the risk of getting infected or infecting, which is something that did not end up in the media coverage. Also, the fact that prisoners themselves took measures to reorganize the very confined spaces in which they lived. Yeah, so one of the prison officials states that he managed to organize reorganize their use of space, up their hygiene protocol, by a lot of soap, because they had been handed out soap, but that was nowhere near enough. And this really connects to the lecture by Dr. Kirchmeier, from which I learned a lot about these micro topoi, or micro spaces, which require sort of a mutually assured discretion, sort of a mutually assured way of not acknowledging the over proximity of the space. And I think the example of the elevator was very interesting in Dr. Kirchmeier's lecture. Here, of course, the cell almost exacerbates the need for these protocols, mutually assured discretion. And this other point, and I was intrigued to read that I think next week Dr. van der Waal is going to talk about the significance of soap and all these social contexts and the social construction of the idea of hygiene, which, of course, when we talk about cultural scripts about the criminal, the racialization of criminality, the racialization of hygiene, all of which sort of coincide in this prison situation, where criminals are generally presented as less hygienic, people who struggle to maintain personal hygiene without sort of an institutional context. And I'm just looking forward to that lecture next week. And it's sort of agent perspectives like these who are really quite or establish a stark contrast to the representation of these prisons in the mass media press coverage, who provide these images of the obviously existing overcrowding, but pay no attention to the tactics of everyday life that prisoners employ to, in fact, tackle these challenges of hygiene and cohabitation. Now, then, of course, the tendencies to reduce. Sorry, let me get a sip of bad coffee here. Yes. So now sort of this tendency to reduce the experience to statistics, which sort of that starting point of biopolitics, the aggregate into statistics, which are then used to treat individuals, is something that is very much present in the media coverage. So one of the representations, one of the press articles started saying, okay, so this situation really confronts us with how much a prisoner costs, and to imprison a person in Chile costs about as much as to give them a constitute scholarship to do a PhD abroad. So I mean, this it's an economical challenge, but much rather than focus on, for example, the experiences of prisoners during this crisis, the reduction into statistics started an entire conversation about the future of the prison system, not because of the individual experience, the ethics of imprisonment, but because of the economic costs, of course. And this is where we really get to the press coverages and the media's stake in this economization of the image of incarceration, which really brings us to the fact that violence sells, male violence sells, and the media sort of benefits from framing the prisoner as a violent body in need of restraint and control, and emphasizing the threat of the masculine body with very little appreciation, of course, for the diversities of gender identities among the inmate population, a theme in and of itself. And in the Converging Horizon project, for example, a part of the research team in Argentina is doing field work with incarcerated transgender migrants from Bolivia in Argentinian prisons, which will really provide empirical input to sort of demystify this over masculinization of the body of the inmate. And perhaps now moving on to the not only these agent perspectives that have allowed us to demystify some of these images, but also how on the level of everyday experience social actors involved in the prison system deal with this press coverage. I'd like to focus briefly on this general distrust and self-organization of information that characterizes both prison officials and prisoners. So we found that several prison officials reported a mistrust in national and regional media, a tendency to self-organize through contact with colleagues in other institutions, and a tendency to consult alternative media. So a lot of these prison officials stated that they didn't really watch television at all or visit the major news websites. Same applied to prisoners. They also tended to get information from informal circuits, from counter-hegemonic media, and even though officially non-existent, through illicit telephones and the internet. Now, how does this take us back to this question of biopolitics? And in Lemke's development of the notion of biopolitics, he states the following questions: what forms of life are regarded as socially valuable and which are considered not worth living? What existential hardships, what physical and psychic suffering attract political, medical, scientific, and social attention and are regarded as intolerable and as a priority for research? Now, we see here in both the press coverage and in the agent perspectives that although there's quite some attention to COVID-19 infection, there's little to no attention to the psychological effects it has had on inmates, but also on prison guards and social workers, which are substantial. And in many of the interviews, the challenges of getting through a day where prisoners have to spend their entire day in the cell or a reduced amount of time outside. And for example, the approaches by creative therapists to give prisoners sort of artistic assignments to deal with the COVID-19 situation are really basically ignored in the press coverage and in the subsequent research agendas, of course. Maybe to continue this, so how forms of domination, mechanisms of exclusion, and the experience of racism and sexism inscribed into them, and how do they alter it in terms of its physical appearance, state of health, and life expectancy? And so I mean, probably the most obvious, and we don't have a lot of time to develop this, unfortunately, but I hope to have stimulated your thinking about this, is this enormously crude gender binary that is projected onto this representation. The reduction of the inmate to a physical body whose health is determined by having COVID-19 or not, which another sort of very crude binary with very little attention for the mental health and the capacity for sort of self-organization. And more so, the question, so why these deformations and this interest in media, in the sort of the economics of media representation, and how they contribute to a bioeconomics of the inmate whose value lies in this image of danger. So Lemke writes, the notion of bioeconomics investigates the economy of the politics of life, who profits and how from the regulation and improvement of life processes in terms of, for example, financial gain, political influence, scientific reputation, and social prestige. So on the right here, we have President Pinilla, whose bioeconomical interest in the life of the prisoner and the construction of the idea of the life of the inmate very much resides on a self-representation as a law and order president who bears the cost and suffers such burdens as poverty, illness, and premature death because of these processes. What forms of exploitation and commercialization of human and non-human life can be observed? So here we can really see the media that we've studied as an actor who exploits and commercializes the situation of COVID-19 in prisons. A sort of a where this situation in the prison is a subset of a more general modification of COVID-19, which we've also seen in the lecture by Professor Valdivia and Judith Jansma and James Lee, which was the first of this lecture series. And also this commodification of the representation and the construction of the life of the inmate, of course, falls into a more general tendency to sell, and this image sells very well the violent, disruptive prisoner who needs control and restraint. Now, as we approach the last two minutes of this presentation, I'd like to sort of close off by sort of hoping to have started a conversation about the role of press coverage in constructing this image of COVID-19 in prisons as a performance of biopolitics. And I'd also like to have demonstrated the need to juxtapose these agent perspectives, which can only be generated by way of interviews, by way of direct contact with the social actors whose lives are abstracted in these images, whose lives are turned into aggregates for the purposes of a biopolitics, which really requires us as academics to, well, unfortunately in these times, start Skype conversations, but really start one-to-one interactions with the social actors who are sort of affected by these representations. And as such, we can intervene both in the media literacy of social actors involved in this dynamic, which is really what the Converging Horizons project is about. So part of the outreach program is about media literacy interventions in both in context of marginalization and in the context of the production of these images, but also our own as academics. Yeah. So we can spend a lot of time only reviewing these media representations and identifying the master narratives, the use of tropes and the sort of the recurring themes. But I think until we start including these social actors living with and affected by these representations, we're really only grasping one part of that dynamic. So I think without extending this any further, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and look forward to your questions, both in English and in Spanish, if you should so choose. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, dear Konstantin, for this very rich and deep presentations. I'm sure there will be many, many questions. In order to ask them, everyone in the audience, please simply click in the lower right corner on your screen on the two white arrows on pink ground, and after that click on the speech bubble, and then you can ask your questions in the chat. The chat is open as of now. Comments, questions, everything is very welcome. So in the meantime, while everyone is typing, as I said, thank you so much, Konstantin. That was a very rich and very, very urgent topic you covered. Plus, thank you also for all the great cross-links you established between your lecture, your topic, and the other lectures of the series. So in case anyone in the audience has missed any of the previous lectures that Konstantin has mentioned, you can watch them all in full recordings as full YouTube recordings accessible through our website, the project website, the one through which most of you will have logged on to today's session. If you don't know the website yet, you can simply Google Cultures of the Crisis Groningen, or you can wait until the end of today's presentation, then we will have a QR code which you can scan to access this website. So much for a little bit of intermittent product placement, but let's get back to this. And of course, everyone is very welcome to also attend the following lectures, which Konstantin also very nicely connected to. But to get back to the actual topic, I was totally fascinated by your comments or by your use of Foucault's biopolitics and also the updates by Lippert, so to speak, because I'm currently interested research-wise in ethical situations of average thinking. So when is it actually as ethically possible? When is it, say, ethically applicable to calculated averages? In which situations or in which context? Which actually is the big question I'm dealing with currently, and I was wondering how or why, if and how you might want to relate this to the case at hand, to the Chilean prison scenery. So because I found it very intriguing how you said, okay, first there's the reduction to statistics. That's step one, and step two is then a calculation and well, somehow transforming things into a way more ethical direction. Namely, once everyone is reduced to statistics, then you can play with the numbers and say, okay, these numbers, so to speak, we don't need anymore, or this is where we have to draw the line in this average context, etc. So I was wondering, could you, because I'm really at just the beginning of thinking this further and actually currently searching for examples, and I found like the application of Foucault's biopolitics is a brilliant path there. Where would you, what would you say would be a better way to go about this? I mean, we do need statistics, like in, say, to establish certain. So if we now speak about the COVID scenario in more general terms, we do need statistics, right? So we do need numbers in order to know how, for instance, how dangerous the virus is in comparison to other viruses, just as an example. Mm-hmm. So between this, say, apparently normal or reasonable kind of statistics and reducing inmates to second-class citizens, or to people about which, cynically speaking, it's not so important if they die or not, right? Which is the ultimate outcome of this, right? So this was the Lemke thought you presented, if I got it right. Mm-hmm. So where to draw the line? Where is it? Can this be conceptualized more closely? Where the problems in thinking in averages or thinking in statistics begin, in your view, in connection to your project?
Yeah. So thank you very much for that question. I think it is sort of firstly proof of the point that approaching these representations from the notion of biopolitics really starts this ethical conversation and makes the ethical conversation possible. So I mean, the counter question would be, why focus on this statistic and not on another? So for example, why are we gathering information about infections in prison, but are we not gathering information about the psychological effect of the lockdown in prison? Firstly, I mean, because you're really avoiding by doing so, a conversation about the psychological state of inmates, which has to be held, which is long overdue as well. And the second is, where does the pragmatical need for statistics as a basis for macro policy turn into the danger of dehumanization? And one of the prison officials said, well, I mean, this is what happens. We start thinking in numbers of infection, and we start thinking in cost, and then we start determining how many masks we can get into the prison. And at some point it costs too much. And this aggregate outweighs the obvious need. Now, if you're asking me for sort of a judgment, I'm afraid that is beyond the scope of my both intellectual capacity and also academic authority. But I think that if we can contribute to this political discussion by unmasking sort of how these statistics are constructed, and the role that press coverage plays in that, and the possible role that counter narratives and sort of agent perspectives can play in enriching and making that ethical discussion more balanced, then I think that will be our contribution.
Right, thank you. So here comes the first question from a member of the audience. It's a rather general question. I was wondering, I read out the question, if the press in Chile is regulated and or influenced by the government, and if the biopolitical view of the press is in line with or opposing the view of the government. So as I said, a very general question. Konstantin, can you say anything about this?
So it's a very all-encompassing question, and of course the relations between media and actors in the government is complex, intricate. Media in Chile, especially the larger outlets like T13, certainly have political affiliations. Now, if you're asking if the sort of the biopolitical analysis of what we are seeing here is in line with the view of the government, I'm afraid for me those categories are a bit too broad to be able to comment on that in any sort of intelligent way. What I can say is that this biopolitical approach to press coverage does very much coincide with several of the social actors that we talk to individually. So I was really surprised by the statements of prison officials who say, we've long given up on getting our news from these sort of established mass press outlets. They provide a very reductive view of the situation. They have no attention for all the positive initiatives, for the creative programs, the creative therapy programs in prison, the work that both guards and social workers are also doing in this situation, the many constructive collaborations. So perhaps I'm not really answering, or even a bit avoiding your question there, but trying to give you an answer from the lived experience of the officials that we talked to.
Well, thanks. I think that was more than a good answer, given the broadness of the question. Absolutely. Here's a more factual question from the same member of the audience. In fact, since you, Konstantin, I read out the question again, mentioned that only one female prison was discussed in the media. how is the proportion of male and female prisons in Chile, and were there any riots, protests in female prisons that were ignored, for instance?
So again, I wish I had the statistic present. Perhaps Gonzalo is looking up the specific numbers on this right now, which we have somewhere, but I don't have them present right now. So it's certainly not 1%. I think it's
Yeah, I just saw that Gonzalo actually just posted a link answering this question, I think. So everyone
excellent. Yes.
Click on that. Yeah, there you go.
Perfect. So we
one
can
of the advantages of tandem presentations, really. Gonzalo, thanks so much, dear Gonzalo. That's brilliant.
Exactly.
So
Gonzalo and I have quite some mileage in conducting interviews in prisons together. So we're quite the team. Sorry, and then the second part of the Luis's question is, were there any riots or protests in female prisons that were ignored? From the amount of interviews that we've conducted to now, I cannot recall a riot or a protest that has been ignored. Of course, this is a selection, and we've just started this. But we can state that there has been no press coverage in the corpus that we created. But I think if you sort of look at, sort of in a more general sense, the way that female prisons are being reported on in the press will generally turn the female criminal into a passive agent. In most of the media discourse, the female criminal is constructed as either this passive accomplice of a man who corrupted her, or sort of the perpetrator of a crime of passion where the woman in question killed or assaulted a man out of sort of more sentimental reasons, which are of course enormously reductive gender stereotypical representations.
Okay.
Yes.
Great, thanks. Here comes the next question I read out, which is more about, say, approaches towards, if not solutions, alleviations, maybe. Thank you for directing the gaze at the margins of society and looking at the situation of these disenfranchised groups. I would like to hear more about initiatives for creative occupations you mentioned briefly. So could you elaborate a bit more on ongoing projects and perhaps also whether aspects of biopolitics are addressed in these?
Yes. So, yes, thank you so much for this question. So one of the prison officials that we talked to worked with a sort of creative therapy program, and what they tended to do was have these workshops where they would sort of do paintings, mosaics that expressed anything from a place of sort of a place of mental state of comfort for them, or something that represented their culture, or just something that interested them. So, however, these workshops were cancelled due to the situation and the proximity problem. So they gave the prisoners an assignment where they had to represent the sort of issues on their mind in drawings, and this person commented on a lot of prisoners starting to make these comic narratives, sort of short series, a bit like if you read a newspaper, there's these really short short comics. I mean, this is a genre that I know almost nothing about. Thomas Geite, who might be in the audience, could probably comment on this with much more authority. Um, um, so and a lot of these focused on the risk of infection and the risks of their families. So I think one of the examples that was named was a comic where a couple of kids tell their father to be careful and to wear his mask, and that if he doesn't, that he might get infected, and then the father's all sort of brave and it's about it, but then he does get infected. So there's this sort of this really short cycle of this sort of poetic justice in a nutshell there. But this I think the interesting thing about this example is that it was one of the many experiences that really fall outside of this scope, as the prisoner as this tough, dangerous person who uses COVID-19 opportunistically to get out of prison earlier or something, and then go back to stealing. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Here's one question on one of the pictures, one of the images you showed, which actually also caught my eye. So thank you for this great question. The question goes, thank you, Konstantin, for a great lecture and a great research project. What I found particularly disturbing, and what I was not familiar with from European representations of inmates, was the aesthetics of a mere crowd or a mere mass of prisoners. For instance, on slide 13. This moment of de-individualization and dehumanization looks like a visual equivalent of the biopolitics of statistics.
Yeah.
This visual representation of masses of inmates something you observe frequently in your research? So maybe we can show this picture again. I assume I'm just going through this one. But this one here is meant, right? Wait, that one.
Yeah.
Here.
So exactly. Yeah.
What do you say, Konstantin?
Okay. So I'd like to before I answer this a caveat. So I think I'm always very cautious to think of a Europe Latin America binary, and then my mind immediately tries to think of an example in a European context of a similar sort of massing of people, and I immediately think of the refugee camp. Southern Italy, and this is something, of course, very much in the focus of Dr. Lippert's research. Secondly, that if we demonstrate for a political cause, which there's very little culture of that recently in Europe, and riot police comes, we will also get put into fairly similar positions if we go sit on the ground in a peaceful protest. So that's sort of the caveat. The second comment is this picture is from a prison in San Salvador. In this particular case, but it does represent a practice that you will find in several Latin American countries. In prisons I have been to, there are sections with non-compliant prisoners who outright refuse any type of programming, any type of interaction with sociologists, and who are very much left to their own devices, other than receiving food several times a day. The situation is very different from the sort of prisons that we may think of when we think of European prisons, which in itself is also a problematic idea. For example, the Scandinavian very open sort of island prison. There was a thought here. I'm almost there. However, and this is an important point. We talk to a lot of inmates, and we talk to them about the amount of people in cells and the overcrowding, and they asked us about whether it was true that in there were prisons in the Netherlands, for example, where people only had one cell, and they were really shocked about this idea of being imprisoned and then also being alone in a cell. So the cultural context of the crowded cell also has to be seen in the light of a cultural context of a very crowded living conditions in the neighborhoods that the incarcerated population in a country like Chile, or in this case El Salvador, comes from. So there really is no experience of living alone. So when we sort of project perhaps these idealized Occidental notions of I'm okay in prison if I have a room to myself, just as I'm okay in my house if I have a room to myself, that might really be sort of over projecting something there. It's a bit of a roundabout answer again. I'm sorry, Christian, but I've tried.
Yeah. Well, thanks. No, I mean, thank you also for the connection with well, with the topic, or say rather with the images of, I mean, the images of refugee refugee camps in the European context, which you kindly mentioned. I was actually wondering something in that direction, because what happens with imagery from European refugee camps quite often, or the status of the imagery evolves in some cases. So you have images where I think, okay, these were taken, for instance, in secret, right? So something that no one should actually ever see, so to speak. But then they also gain a life as something, for instance, to scare people off. So within the huge range between secretly taken pictures that should have never seen the day of light, so to speak, and press photography, images like this are somewhere in the blurry middle, it seems to me. So I was wondering, do you know anything about, say, the policies behind showing these pictures? Is this something that was like taken by some kind of cover journalist or something, and then published without the consent of the prison? Or is it rather something like, okay, here you go, world, if you better not want to be imprisoned with us, right? So this kind of informal, unofficial, in many cases, unofficial scare-off effect of imagery published. I was wondering whether you know anything about the status of images like this by any chance. So this is not so much about the content of the image, but rather how the image, which journey it took, so to speak.
So I mean, this in this specific case, this was one that was taken by a photographer with access to the location, who then sold it to the Associated Press, and it then started showing up in first in Latin American news outlets, and then also in North American and British news outlets. So this specific image was reused several times. Second, your question. So what's the role of these institutions here? Now, I think the sort of the deterring factor of an image like this certainly plays a role. But if you ask for the correct permissions, there is quite a lot of access to be gained. So in a country like Chile, a lot of the people that work in these institutions are very much aware of the development that these institutions are undergoing, the processes that they are in, the rationales behind policies. And they're also not necessarily interested in keeping the reality of the situation out of the sight of the press. I do think they have a frustration with an overemphasis on, for example, the image of violence. And I repeat again that this picture was taken in Salvador, not in Chile. And whereas this one, of course, was, and several of the other pictures that we showed, and this one too. I'm not too sure about the agency in determining the picture content on the part of the institutions. That's really an interesting question. Also, to point out that for more information on the Chilean media landscape, Juan del Valle, who will be presenting, I think, 2 weeks from now, is very much a person to talk to. He's also an expert, not least because of his MA thesis on counter-hegemonic media outlets, such as media outlets representing indigenous identities, such as the Mapuches. Yes.
Well, thank you once more, dear Konstantin. Thanks for such a fascinating talk and for answering all these quite difficult and complex questions today. Those were that was really very deep, both in the practical. I mean, this is a very much a hands-on project on the one hand, but also in the theoretical foundations and analyses offered in the project. So thank you once more. This was really great and very urgent and very important. And extremely insightful. Thank you to everyone in the audience for discussing with us, for asking questions, making comments. Special thanks again to Vera Alexander for taking over the participation management. And again, as Konstantin so kindly made all these links with the other lectures. So we have 3 more lectures coming up in the next weeks, all mentioned today in Konstantin's talk. So please, everyone, be invited, cordially invited to join us again next week, then with the talk by Margriet van der Waal, which Konstantin has already mentioned. Everything, titles, details, speaker details, abstracts can be found on the webpage, the QR code for which will be shown in a minute on your screen. Everything else is on the webpage as well, so please just visit that for further information. And well, yeah, that's it for today. Thanks again, dear Konstantin. Thank you, everyone, and hopefully see and read and hear you very soon. Take good care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.